Vlad III the Impaler ordered people to be impaled, even women and children. In the city of Brașov alone, over 20,000 people were executed by his decree, their bodies left in the streets to terrify the population. He believed fear was more effective than mercy. His nickname, Dracula, became synonymous with brutality. Vlad was born at the end of 1431 in the city of Sighișoara, in Transylvania. His father, Vlad II Dracul, was a member of the Order of the Dragon, a Christian organization fighting against the Ottoman Empire. The family name Dracula comes from this affiliation, meaning son of the dragon. In 1436, his father became ruler of Wallachia, and the family moved to Târgoviște. But peace did not last long. Political intrigue and wars with neighboring powers, especially Hungary and the Ottomans, made Vlad's childhood turbulent. In 1442, Vlad and his younger brother Radu were taken hostage by the Ottoman Empire as part of a political agreement to ensure their father's loyalty to the Sultan. They spent several years in the fortress of Edirne. Vlad studied Ottoman methods of warfare, tactics, language, and religion. But instead of gratitude for the education, resentment grew within him. He never forgot the humiliation and abuse he endured in captivity. In 1447, his father was killed by boyars, and his older brother Mircea was buried alive. At 17, Vlad returned to Wallachia, seeking revenge. His first reign lasted only a few months, but even then he began purging political opponents. He secured power only in 1456. From that point on, the most brutal period of his rule began. Vlad didn't just punish, he turned punishment into a theater of horror. Impalement became the symbol of his rule. According to some accounts, over 30,000 people were executed in a single year. He had particular hatred for the boyars, whom he considered traitors. In Easter 1457, he invited them to a feast in Târgoviște. During the celebration, he ordered them all seized. The elderly were executed immediately. The young were forced to march into the Carpathians to build a fortress. Many died on the way. To Vlad, order and fear were the foundation of stability. He believed a weak ruler led to chaos. That's why anyone suspected of conspiracy, deceit, or even petty crime faced the stake or other public punishment. Even women who committed adultery were executed. In 1459, Vlad the Impaler carried out one of the most brutal purges of his rule. After the city of Brașov began supporting his enemies, merchants sympathetic to the Hungarians, he launched a personal punitive campaign. The city was surrounded, captured, and everyone even remotely associated with his opponents was executed. People were impaled right on the streets, so that the living could witness the consequences of betrayal. Much of Vlad's reign was defined by his fierce resistance to the Ottoman Empire. In 1461, Sultan Mehmed II demanded tribute from Vlad. In response, Vlad had the Ottoman envoys impaled. They were not simply killed, they were humiliated, sending a clear message that Wallachia would not submit to Istanbul. It was a direct challenge. In the spring of 1462, he led a raid into Ottoman territory, destroying villages, burning fields, and poisoning wells. But the most infamous episode was the so-called Forest of the Impaled. When Sultan Mehmed II invaded Wallachia with a 90,000-strong army, he was met with a horrifying sight. 20,000 Ottoman prisoners impaled along the road to Târgoviște. It was a deliberate act to demoralize the invaders. Despite his valiant resistance, the forces were uneven. Vlad was forced to flee to Transylvania, where he was captured and imprisoned by order of Hungarian King Matthias Corvinus. Ironically, he was accused of colluding with the Ottomans, despite his ruthless opposition to them. His imprisonment lasted about 12 years. During this time, his brother Radu the Handsome, who had allied with the Ottomans, became ruler of Wallachia. He was soft and obedient to the Sultan, and many of the boyars quickly shifted their loyalty. However, his rule relied entirely on Ottoman military support. Around 1475, Vlad was released and regained some backing to reclaim the throne. In 1476, he became ruler of Wallachia for the third time. But this time, his reign lasted only a few months. By winter of that same year, he was killed in battle, most likely during a clash with an Ottoman unit or due to betrayal by his own boyars. His head was sent to Istanbul and displayed on a spike at the city gates as proof of the death of the bloodthirsty Wallachian prince. After the death of Vlad III the Impaler, his image did not fade into obscurity. On the contrary, it transformed into a symbol of fear, brutality, and uncompromising power. In Wallachia, he was remembered as a harsh but effective ruler who halted the collapse of statehood and punished boyar treason. To part of the population, he remained a figure who restored order where there had been chaos, even at the cost of mass executions. The Ottomans recalled him with dread, while Hungarian sources at times described him with respect despite their conflicts. His cruelty became the reason Europe began speaking about him. Letters, reports, and rumors of the prince who impaled his enemies spread through courts, monasteries, and marketplaces. In the 16th century, German and Russian chronicles began to emerge with exaggerated stories about Vlad. Some were true, others were overblown or entirely fictional. He became part of political propaganda, for some a hero, for others a monster. In the 19th century, his name returned to public attention, this time through Bram Stoker, the Irish writer who in 1897 published the novel Dracula. Stoker borrowed only the name and general atmosphere, but it was enough to transform Vlad from a historical ruler into an archetypal vampire, the embodiment of evil, cruelty, and immortal bloodlust. Thus, the image of Vlad III split. In history, he remains a real political and military strategist, a ruler who acted during constant external threats and internal betrayal. But in mass consciousness, he became a legend, a condensed symbol of horror from which a popular monster was sculpted. His life is an example of how cruelty, political necessity, and historical context can intertwine to create a figure that is impossible to fully condemn or justify. Vlad III the Impaler remains in history as a ruler whose method of governance was bloody but systematic, and whose memory endures as a fear that has not faded even after 5 centuries. The historical figure of Vlad Tepes became a unique phenomenon, existing simultaneously in 2 dimensions, as a real person and as a symbol. In 20th century Romanian historiography, efforts began to rehabilitate Vlad's image. He was presented not only as a brutal ruler, but also as a defender of Wallachian independence who resisted Muslim expansion. During the national revival, Romanians began to use his figure as a symbol of stern but just leadership. Meanwhile, in Western culture, the image of Dracula fully separated from the historical Tepes. Bram Stoker's 1897 novel Dracula only loosely borrowed the real prince's name. The rest was fiction. Yet this was enough to give Vlad a second life, now as an immortal fictional vampire. In the 20th century, Hollywood, British theater, and mass literature cemented his mythological status. He ceased to be seen as a political actor and became an archetypal villain. Most people around the world, upon hearing the name Dracula, are unaware that it refers to a real historical ruler who operated within the violent political framework of the late Middle Ages. Today, historians attempt to separate myth from fact. Vlad III was undeniably brutal. His methods cannot be justified by modern ethical standards. However, in the context of the 15th century, when rulers were often assassinated and enemies encircled from all sides, his actions were consistent with the logic of political survival. The image of Tepes, fused with the folkloric vampire, proved so enduring that it outlasted centuries. He still sells books, movies, souvenirs, and tourist routes. Thus, a ruthless prince from the 15th century has, inadvertently, become one of the most recognizable global cultural brands. After Vlad III's third reign and death in 1476, Wallachia again fell into a period of political instability. But the memory of Tepes did not disappear. It immediately transformed into a tool of propaganda, political influence, and fear. The Ottoman Empire used his name to intimidate, while in Europe, his actions evoked mixed reactions. Condemnation on one hand, admiration on the other. The first mentions of the Forest of the Impaled and his horrific tortures appear in letters from merchants, diplomats, and travelers. One German chronicler wrote that he impaled people with the ease with which we plant cabbage in a field. Such comparisons spread rapidly, shaping the image of a brutal yet methodical ruler. Most of the accounts of Vlad's tortures came from German and Hungarian sources. He was accused of boiling people alive, cutting off women's breasts, forcing mothers to eat their children, and dining near the impaled victims. Some of these claims were likely exaggerated or fabricated, but even neutral sources confirm that the terror was systematic. His harsh punishment for adultery drew particular attention. Women accused of infidelity were often impaled or disemboweled. Vlad considered moral decay a threat to social order and demonstrated this belief through brutal public executions. Another terrifying method was hanging victims' bodies around towns, leaving them to rot in the open. This wasn't just about fear. It was meant to create revulsion and destroy any dignity in death, reinforcing the prince's absolute power over life and death. One especially horrifying story tells of a monastery where monks were walled up alive because they prayed for Vlad's enemies. There are also reports that he destroyed entire villages whose residents refused to pay taxes or supported his opponents. A late 15th century document estimates that Vlad executed around 80,000 people during his rule. This number is staggering, especially considering the size of Wallachia, a relatively small principality at the time. If accurate, it would mean nearly half the adult male population perished. Yet, alongside terror came efficiency. Vlad reformed the tax system, punished boyars who had looted state resources for years, and reasserted control over the borderlands. Roads became safer, corruption diminished, and administration stabilized. His methods were brutal, but the results were undeniable. Some contemporaries claimed that under Vlad's rule, Wallachia was one of the few places where a traveler could leave gold in the middle of the road and return later to find it untouched. This was not a testament to justice or civility, but to a paralyzing fear that held society in an iron grip. After his death, Wallachia quickly lost the stability it had gained. The boyars reclaimed power, the Ottomans tightened control, and Vlad's successors failed to maintain discipline or inspire fear. His brother Radu the Handsome remained in power but relied entirely on support from Istanbul and lacked both the charisma and ruthlessness of his older brother. From a political perspective, Vlad Tepes left behind a paradoxical legacy. He was a cruel tyrant, but also an efficient administrator and defender of sovereignty. His rule was not based on consent or popular support, but on fear, and it was precisely that fear which made his name immortal. Vlad III Tepes did not act in a vacuum. His brutality was a response to specific political conditions. 15th century Wallachia was a borderland state caught between two superpowers, the Ottoman Empire and the Kingdom of Hungary. Every new ruler not only had to seize the throne, but also defend it from internal conspiracies and external invasions. In such circumstances, fear became the only effective tool for stability. Vlad understood that the boyar aristocracy posed the greatest threat. They had murdered his father, buried his brother alive, and betrayed every weakened ruler for decades. That is why Tepes conducted massive purges, executing hundreds of boyar families and replacing them with a new loyal class personally indebted to him. His administrative model was primitive but effective. In each region, he established a denunciation system, encouraging even peasants to report treasonous behavior. Rewards were promised, but if the denunciation proved false, the informer was punished as severely as the accused. This created an atmosphere of total distrust. His attitude toward the clergy was ambivalent. On one hand, he supported the Orthodox Church, built monasteries, and made generous donations. On the other, he had no hesitation in executing priests who collaborated with his enemies or denied his authority. He made no distinction between the sacred and secular, only between loyalists and traitors. One bishop was impaled for refusing to perform funerary rites for executed boyars. Vlad's foreign policy was opportunistic but always based on strength. He skillfully played on the contradictions between the Ottomans and the Hungarians, pledging allegiance to one or the other as needed. But he never relinquished his autonomy. He could not be considered a puppet. When Tepes was imprisoned in Hungary, many European leaders welcomed it, seeing him as an uncontrollable barbarian. Yet others viewed him as a potential hero in the Christian crusade against Islam. In 1475, the Pope even endorsed his release, believing Tsepesh could be a valuable weapon against the Ottomans. From a psychological standpoint, his cruelty was not just political, it was a worldview. He believed that society was held together not by kindness, but by fear of punishment. His upbringing in Ottoman captivity, betrayal by boyars, the deaths of his relatives, and constant warfare shaped in him a conviction. Weakness meant death, and mercy invited treason. These beliefs were transmitted through public acts of cruelty. Vlad created a state in which punishment became a spectacle. He didn't hide victims' bodies, he made them part of the landscape. It was a kind of architectural terror. Town squares, streets, and even highways were lined with impaled corpses. Provoked revulsion but also enforced submission. Vlad's death didn't halt the formation of his cult. In Wallachia, his name didn't fade. It lived on in legends, songs, and terrifying tales. The people feared him but also respected him. To peasants, he remained the prince under whom thieves were afraid to even think of crime. The church never canonized Vlad, although some monasteries in the 20th century attempted to initiate the process. The number of victims, the cruelty of his methods, and his general reputation proved insurmountable. Yet in Romania, he began to be portrayed as a national hero, a defender against Islam and a symbol of national character. His legacy became a battleground between history and myth. On one hand, documents confirm mass executions. On the other, romanticized notions of a ruler who merely used harsh means to enforce order. The truth lies somewhere in between. Vlad III Tsepesh was a product of his time, a man for whom cruelty was the language of politics. After the death of Vlad III Tsepesh, his second and far longer life began in literature, folklore, and mass culture. The name Dracula, which originally meant son of the dragon, gradually lost its connection to the Christian order of the dragon and acquired an occult, demonic meaning. This transformation was driven not only by Vlad's cruel reign, but also by publications in Germany, Hungary, and Poland that portrayed him as a ruthless blood drinker. In 1499, one of the first pamphlets with woodcut illustrations was published in Nuremberg, depicting Tsepesh as a monster in human form who impaled children and drank blood from silver goblets. These texts greatly influenced the formation of Vlad's image as a supernatural criminal. The pamphlets mixed facts, rumors, and pure fabrication. They were not historical accounts, but political satire and medieval tabloid sensationalism. In the 19th century, Irish writer Bram Stoker was researching a novel in the British Museum Library when he came across references to Vlad III, his cruelty, and the nickname Dracula. Although Stoker had never visited Romania or spoken Romanian, these fragments became the foundation for his iconic Gothic novel Dracula, 1897. In the book, the main character is an immortal vampire count from Transylvania who travels to London to find new victims. Vlad Tsepesh is briefly mentioned as the vampire's historical ancestor. This novel launched an entire genre. In the 20th century, the image of Dracula became part of global culture. From the silent film Nosferatu, 1922, to Hollywood productions starring Bela Lugosi, 1931, Christopher Lee, 1958, and Gary Oldman, 1992. None of these portrayals had anything in common with the real Vlad III, but all solidified his myth in the minds of millions. In socialist Romania under Nicolae Ceausescu, Tsepesh was used in official propaganda as an example of a strong hand, a patriot unafraid to restore order. Rather than emphasizing his brutality, state messaging highlighted his ability to resist external threats and punish corruption. He was portrayed as a precursor to the modern strong state. In the 1970s and 1980s, a tourism boom began in Transylvania. Bran Castle, which Vlad never lived in, was promoted as Dracula's castle and became the region's main tourist attraction. Visitors from around the world came to see where the vampire lived, unaware that historical reality was far more complex. Romania embraced this myth commercially. Themed hotels, souvenirs, festivals, and costume shows emerged. After the fall of socialism in the 1990s, Vlad's image fully split. To some, he became a hero. To others, a monster. Some historians tried to rehabilitate his legacy, emphasizing his role as a statesman. Others studied his methods of terror as a classical example of authoritarian behavior before the concept of totalitarianism even existed. Vlad III Tepes died in the 15th century, but his image still lives in films, books, tourism, music, and video games. He is remembered not as a person, but as an archetype. It is the most terrifying yet effective form of immortality, to survive not in the flesh, but in fear. He wasn't a vampire. He didn't drink blood, but he left behind mountains of corpses, rivers of fear, and a memory that hasn't faded in over 5 centuries. Vlad III Tepes, the son of the dragon, turned Wallachia into a state built on fear. His methods were brutal but effective. He crushed the boyars, destroyed his enemies, and built order on the bones of traitors. He didn't care about reputation. He cared about power. He executed tens of thousands. He impaled, boiled people alive, walled up monks, and murdered envoys. But under his rule, no one dared steal, and thieves were afraid to even think of crime. The Ottomans feared him. Western Europe distrusted him. But even the Pope acknowledged, this cruel prince might be the last defense against the Islamic tide. After death, his name became a symbol of evil. His myth survived the centuries. Dracula, neither hero nor demon, was a real ruler made immortal not by legend, but by fear. This is not a story about a vampire. This is the story of a man who proved that fear is stronger than love, and made the world tremble even after death. Vlad III Tepes remains in history not only as a cruel prince but as a symbol of absolute control. He didn't merely destroy his enemies. He constructed a system in which everyone lived in constant anticipation of punishment. And it was this anticipation that became his greatest weapon. Unlike many despots, Tepes didn't rule by emotion. His cruelty wasn't random. It was systematic, deliberate, and theatrical. He executed not just to punish, but to set an example. And not just to set an example, but to implant fear deep into the subconscious of the masses. It was a strategy of psychological paralysis. A person who fears even to think will never act. A person who sees a stake at the church, the marketplace, and the city gates no longer thinks in terms of right or wrong. They operate only in the category of survival. Contemporaries described him as just within horror. To peasants, he was the only one punishing the boyars. To merchants, he was the protector of trade caravans. To officials, a reminder that corruption had a cost. But even his most loyal men were never sure they'd wake up alive the next morning. Fear became the language of the state. It replaced law, replaced dialogue, replaced empathy. This is the Tepes phenomenon. He created a model of power where fear wasn't a byproduct, it was the foundation. His political philosophy, though never written down, was evident in his actions. Weakness is a crime, trust is a risk, mercy is weakness. He didn't envision the ideal ruler as a kind father of the people, but as a sword that does not allow enemies to lift their heads. That's why he left no lasting succession. Because fear cannot be inherited, it only lasts as long as its source. When Vlad disappeared, so did the order. All that remained was the myth,